Hello, it's Dr. Bettina here. I'm talking today about ADHD and ODD. We've had a letter from a father whose son has recently got both of these diagnoses and he's struggling. He says he feels quite judged by other parents. He can get in these head-on battles with his son and a lot of calls from school to say he's misbehaving. And he said, "Do you have any top tips for how I can manage?" Now, parenting kids with these diagnoses together of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and oppositional defiance disorder can be really hard. They are wonderful kids, but they're highly spirited and they often want to do the opposite of what you want them to do. So you can end up in these struggles and having these battles. So today I've got 6 top tips for you for how to support a child who has these diagnoses. Number 1, understand what ADHD and ODD means. ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It tells us something about how a child's brain is functioning. It's different for every child, but essentially children struggle to sit and attend when things are not so interesting to them. They often have a lot of energy, they need lots of movement breaks, and they can be quite impulsive, jumping in and saying and doing things rather quickly without thinking. And they often have these huge emotional reactions, these big highs and these big lows. Add in a dose of ODD, which is oppositional defiance disorder, and you have a child who doesn't like following rules, who will be quite argumentative, and you get into these power struggles with them. So understand first of all what that means, and it's going to be different for every child. Number 2, take time to learn about how your child's brain functions in any moment of the day. So there are these control centers in the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and they have a limited resource and they're very affected by the context. Now, this is the bit of the brain that is slow to develop in ADHD. So it can be particularly problematic for a child with ADHD if they are upset, if they're anxious, if they haven't slept well, if they're hungry. Their behaviour is going to be more challenging. And often when you pick them up from school, they've been working really hard to keep it together at school all day. And you get this kind of child who really can't regulate themselves at all. So really try to reduce the demands when you know that their prefrontal cortex resource is low. And really work hard at the sleep, diet, exercise with these kids because it can make a really big difference to how the brain functions. Number 3, have really clear and consistent routines and rules and expectations. It's really helpful to try to do the same thing every day where possible. There's this saying, it's easier to say no to dessert, like I'm not going to have dessert every day, than to go on a diet. And that's just because it's a rule. You don't have to negotiate with yourself every time you come to a dessert. It's the same with kids. If you have a rule, you have a routine, then they know what's happening and they don't have to fight and push against it. It's like the same with boundaries. If you just say there are no screens on a school day, for example, and you never change that, then they begin to know that that's what you really mean. I mean, adaptability and flexibility is obviously very important as a parent, but I think with these kids, particularly when you're establishing a rule, being really consistent is important. Number 4, model calm emotional regulation. Now, these kids can be really frustrating, but yelling and shouting and joining in with them really does not help. Actually, at those times, they have least control of this prefrontal cortex, is least in control of the brain. So they need you to be the most regulated to help them to find their regulation. So when you're saying no, just say the answer is no and have a little compassion. I really understand why you don't want to do this, but the answer is still no. And then later you can have a rational conversation. There's no point in talking in a rational way to a brain where the prefrontal cortex is offline, which is what happens when a child is struggling emotionally. Number 5, find some support. These kids are really, really tough. It makes such a difference to know that you're not alone, to share stories with other parents, to share tips about how you're managing things. Parents who have kids who have ADHD and ODD as well can feel very judged by people around them. It's going to take a while for your kids to learn these emotional regulation skills. So, try not to let that get to you. And then the last one is whatever goes on at school, just try to leave it at school. Now, medication for ADHD can be really helpful for some children when you get the right medicine in the right dose. It helps them to focus and to slow down and to make really good choices. And you can help the teacher by giving them as much information as you can about your child so they reframe the behaviour. We really want to shift from seeing these children as being naughty, which they often can be, and bad and lazy and difficult. We want to shift it as a reframe to say, no, this is something that's going on in their brain and we need to help them and come alongside them in order to help them to develop these skills and connect the prefrontal cortex to the rest of the brain in these more difficult moments. And I would really let what happens at school stay at school. I wouldn't have lots of battles about homework or re-punishing kids if they did something at school. All kids want to be in a good relationship with adults, and we need to support them and help them to understand themselves so they can do that as best they can. And don't give up. These are not bad kids. They are good kids who are having a hard time and they need your unconditional support. And you are also not a bad parent. This can be really tough. So stick with it and know that what you're doing is just so important for them in the long run.